Jackson irritates me. It's just that simple. I expect him to annoy me. I expect him to grate my nerves.
2 years previous, Phil Jackson had 54 wins, then 37 wins.
Say he needs to get the hell out of town, that we need to put barricades up.
He decided I'm going to tear it all down, so they had 17 wins his first year.
He doesn't care about the city. He's just here collecting money, stealing a check as far as I'm concerned.
Tear it all down again. You have no right to do it.
When I think about Phil Jackson, I think about a guy who almost lives in a warped reality.
This is a disgrace, and somebody needs to do something about Phil Jackson right now. Get him the hell out of New York.
The Los Angeles Lakers are in a tough spot right now, and fortunately for them, they are taking advice from the great Phil Jackson, which as much as I adore Phil Jackson as a basketball coach, I am very skeptical of his abilities as an executive. And although he is just simply advising Jeannie Buss about how to move forward, let's take a look back at his tumultuous tenure when he literally ruined the New York Knicks. On March 18, 2014, when the already Hall of Famer Phil Jackson was announced to be the president of the New York Knicks, a franchise that hadn't won a championship in nearly 50 years, New York Knicks fans were delighted. Knicks fans gave Phil Jackson a standing ovation. A 13-time NBA champion as both a player and a head coach was now leading the front office. And not only did the future seem immediately brighter as a result, but their superstar, who was due to be a free agent, also decided to stay around on a brand new 5-year contract as well. But little did anyone at the time know that a short 3 years later, that very same superstar would want to leave the team. The New York Knicks would record a franchise record 65 losses in a season, and any decision rooted in luck by Phil Jackson would immediately be followed up with a head-scratching decision, making you wonder the legitimacy of the Zen Master himself. How did Phil Jackson, a man with 13 NBA championships, a man who was able to manage the personalities of Meta World Peace and Dennis Rodman, alongside with larger-than-life egos like Shaquille O'Neal and the late great Kobe Bryant, alongside being the coach of the greatest player of all time in Michael Jordan, ruin a New York Knicks team that in 2012 and 2013 finished with a 54-28 record? Well, in this video, we're going to discuss how. Cue the intro. What's going on, everybody? Phil Jackson was hired mid-season to be the New York Knicks team president with a record-breaking $60 million 5-year contract, and according to Darren Rovell, was the highest ever paid sports team executive at the time. After May 18th, the day that Phil Jackson had his introductory press conference, the Knicks finished the NBA season with an overall record of 37 wins and 45 losses to finish just short of the playoffs. This team wasn't necessarily at the very bottom of the NBA, but they weren't really close to the top either. One could say that they were currently in purgatory, but there were a lot of things to be optimistic about. Despite ending the season on a better note than they started, Jackson made the move to immediately fire not only the head coach Mike Woodson, but his entire coaching staff as well. Move over Mike Woodson and hello Phil Jackson and his famous triangle offense. As a result, the Knicks would be looking for a new head coach, one that would be willing to work with Phil Jackson's triangle offense. Although at the time, Steve Kerr was also rumored to possibly be the new head coach of the New York Knicks, being lured over by his former head coach. What ultimately stopped him from making this decision and instead choosing the Golden State Warriors was Jackson's stubbornness towards compromising, a theme which we'll see plenty of times in this video. Basically, in Phil Jackson's mind, he had won 13 NBA championships, 11 as a head coach, and no one was going to tell him what offense was the best to run to win championships. As a result, the Knicks and Phil Jackson made the move to sign former NBA player and champion under Phil Jackson previously, Derek Fisher. Derek Fisher was essentially just a puppet for Phil Jackson's offensive scheme.
I love the triangle system. I believe with the roster we have, we can utilize it to be more efficient, to be more effective.
If anyone was going to run the triangle offense for Phil Jackson, it was going to be a man who had won 5 NBA championships with the Los Angeles Lakers while doing so. And to be honest, if you were a New York Knicks fan at the time, you couldn't necessarily be mad at this signing. As a matter of fact, it may have inspired the most hope and excitement this franchise had seen since, well, the 2012 to 2013 season. Sure, Derek Fisher was unproven and probably just a puppet for Phil Jackson, but ultimately with Phil Jackson's coaching history, it seemed like a good decision and the first step towards creating a new New York Knicks offense. With the signing of new head coach Derek Fisher, the Knicks were able to retain their star forward Carmelo Anthony. Sure, he opted out of his contract and tested free agency a little bit, but ultimately, Carmelo Anthony re-signed with the New York Knicks on a 5-year, $124 million contract. These two moves went over remarkably with New York Knicks fans. They got their new head coach, the apprentice to Phil Jackson, and got their franchise cornerstone back. But that was about the first and final time that New York Knicks fans were ever really happy with Phil Jackson. Jackson's first trade as president of basketball operations for the New York Knicks was sending former Defensive Player of the Year Tyson Chandler and guard Raymond Felton to the Dallas Mavericks for Jose Calderon, Sam Dalembert, Wayne Ellington, Shane Larkin, and 2 2014 second-round draft picks. Phil Jackson said the trade was to change some of the culture of the team. Initially, New York Knicks fans were happy with this trade.
Phil Jackson convincing Dallas that Tyson Chandler can still play and dumping Raymond Felton in the process. Yes! Wow, the Mavericks are trading 4 players and 2 second-round picks for Raymond Felton and Tyson Chandler. Well played, Phil Jackson.
But with the power of hindsight, when you consider that just 2 years later, the only player acquired in the trade to start more than 30 games for the New York Knicks at all was Jose Calderon, and Wayne Ellington was soon traded away for Travis Outlaw, who was soon traded away for Arnett Moultrie, a player who had never even suited up for the New York Knicks, all before the first game of the season, it became abundantly clear that this trade was bad. But maybe with those 2 second-round picks acquired in the trade, maybe, just maybe, Phil Jackson will be able to snipe some sort of unscouted star in the draft. Just kidding. With those picks, Phil Jackson selected Thanasis Antetokounmpo and Clay Anthony Early, both of whom would start a combined 9 games in their New York Knicks career. However, don't just take my word that these trades were bad. Don't just take my word that these coaching decisions were bad. See the results for yourself. To start the 2014 to 2015 NBA season, the New York Knicks started off just 2-8. But after a 109-93 win over the Denver Nuggets, a game in which Carmelo Anthony and J.R. Smith both had 28 points, the New York Knicks' early skids seemed to be simmering down. However, if anything, it was just getting started. After that win, the New York Knicks would go on to win just 2 out of their next 30 games. And in that stretch would have a losing streak stretched to 16 games, which was good for the longest in franchise history. To help end this drought, Phil Jackson made a 3-team trade with the OKC Thunder and the Cleveland Cavaliers to exchange core players like Iman Shumpert and J.R. Smith for Lou Amundsen, Alex Kirk, and Lance Thomas. Fans were not only disappointed that their season had ended before the All-Star break, but also that their favorite players and valuable players were being traded away for pennies on the dime.
Phil Jackson, how can you trade Iman Shumpert and J.R. Smith literally as throwaways and getting nothing in return? So the New York Knicks trade J.R. Smith and Iman Shumpert for 3 bench warmers. I wonder what Phil Jackson is up to.
The best player that the New York Knicks received in this trade was Lance Thomas, who never even started more than 40 games a season for the New York Knicks, or arguably the 2019 second-round pick that they acquired alongside the trio of players. Either way, the trade didn't do much for the New York Knicks as a team, and they finished the 2014 to 2015 season with 17 wins and 65 losses, the worst record in franchise history. Phil Jackson admitted before the season ended, "So far, my experiment has fallen flat on its face," meaning that finally his stubbornness relating to the offensive scheme had faded to some extent. And maybe Knicks fans and Phil Jackson could agree to put year 1 behind them. After all, it was a rebuild, and they were in purgatory. But the fact that Phil Jackson already admitted that his experiment had failed should lead to some causes of concern, at least amongst New York Knicks fans. And to his credit, with the 4th overall pick in that year's NBA draft, the New York Knicks selected Kristaps Porzingis, a pick that many at the time were quick to discredit and doubt. Even the loudest Knicks fan himself couldn't help from giving his 2 cents.
I'm very confused at this pick simply because when I think about Phil Jackson, he made promises that he's simply not keeping. And if I seem a bit agitated, yes, it would happen to be because I'm on vacation and I came off vacation just to talk about this subject because as a native New Yorker, I'm completely disgusted.
The overall consensus that Knicks fans had about Porzingis is that he probably wasn't going to be able to contribute quick enough to warrant drafting 4th overall. During the same draft, the Knicks would also trade away Tim Hardaway Jr. in a 3-team trade once again to acquire Jerian Grant, the 19th overall pick in that same draft. To wrap up his team before the season start, Phil Jackson also signed veterans like Aaron Aflalo, Robin Lopez, and Derek Williams. At this point, prior to the season, Knicks fans were ready to move on from the past, in which they at least contended for the NBA playoffs. In a November 21st game in which the Knicks defeated the Houston Rockets 107-102 to improve their record to 8-6, it seemed as if the Phil Jackson era had finally begun. Sure, the New York Knicks had a god-awful season the year prior, but it was almost December and the Knicks had a positive record, and rookie Kristaps Porzingis turned out to be the real deal.
That's amazing. Love the way that this team is playing right now. Phil Jackson for president. Anyone out there still questioning Phil Jackson?
Despite the hot start and the emergence of rookie Kristaps Porzingis, the Knicks would go on to fall apart, becoming streaky at best during the regular season. After losing 96-101 to the Denver Nuggets, the New York Knicks would end up with a 23-31 record, and Derek Fisher was fired from his head coaching position, thus ending his brief stint in coaching. To replace him, Phil Jackson promoted assistant head coach Kurt Rambis, who didn't fare any better as he finished the season 9-19, totaling the Knicks record to 32-50. Phil Jackson had managed to follow up a god-awful season with just a slightly less god-awful season, which would bring us to the beginning of the end for the Zen Master. In most cases, firing a head coach mid-season doesn't look good for an organization. It was just 2 years into the Phil Jackson experiment, and the New York Knicks were already firing their head coach and struggling to make the playoffs despite promises from Phil Jackson that they would at the very least be in playoff contention. In an attempt to steer the ship in the right direction, to replace Derek Fisher as head coach, the New York Knicks and Phil Jackson hired Jeff Hornacek, a coach who in years prior had proven that he could coach a winning team, especially with the Suns in a crowded Western Conference. In addition to bringing in a new head coach, the Knicks attempted to add a star as they traded Jose Calderon, Jerian Grant, and Robin Lopez to the Chicago Bulls for former MVP Derrick Rose, Justin Holiday, and a future second-round pick. The problem with this trade isn't the fact that the Knicks got a good role player, because they did in Derrick Rose. But at the time, Derrick Rose was still being paid like an MVP, but after a laundry list of injuries. It was obvious to everyone that Rose simply wasn't the player he was prior to his injuries, and this is way before Derrick Rose reinvented himself. Trading for Rose was probably just a last-ditch effort to compile a roster decent enough to save Phil Jackson's job. But if you're a New York Knicks fan, once again, you're probably getting PTSD from similar moves that the Knicks have made in their past that are just like this, like trading for Tracy McGrady a few years earlier, despite him clearly not being the player that he once was, but having a horrific contract, trading for Steve Francis, trading for Stephon Marbury. But in addition to overpaying for Derrick Rose, the New York Knicks also decided to pair Derrick Rose with his old center in Joakim Noah, signing him to a multi-year contract up to $18 million a year. At this point, it seemed as if Phil Jackson was simply throwing around money just because he could.
Joakim Noah shouldn't be getting $18 million a season. Come on now, Knicks and Phil Jackson. You're overpaying for a injury-prone center. All I can say is if Phil Jackson pays Joakim Noah $18 million, Dolan better demand Phil take a drug test. I take Dan Gadgerick
over Joakim Noah today. Phil Jackson was literally paying Derrick Rose and Joakim Noah nearly a combined $40 million a season just for their collective accomplishments in Chicago nearly 5 seasons ago. Jackson would also go on to add bench players like Courtney Lee, Brandon Jennings, and Will Hernan Gomez before the offseason ended. Initially, before before the season started, it was reported that Jeff Hornacek, the new head coach, would be allowed to run his own offensive system, and that the triangle offense would be a thing of the past. However, shortly into the season, there were conflicting reports saying that Phil Jackson was happy about the lack of triangle offense being used. But before any controversy regarding the offensive scheme could brew, an offhand comment Phil Jackson made calling LeBron James's business associates his posse set the sports world alight. Not only did LeBron James voice his frustration, but Phil Jackson's very own superstar Carmelo Anthony, notorious for being friends with LeBron James, made his voice known as well, saying, "I don't think you have to be a rocket scientist or an educated person to understand kind of what that means to us."
And the obvious thing is the word itself carries connotation, and I just don't understand that part of it, the word. So, I guess word choice could be something I could regret, but...
Of course, once again, in what seemed like clockwork in the Phil Jackson era, by All-Star break, the New York Knicks were floundering around and barely in the playoff hunt at the record of 23-34. However, after winning just 7 games by the start of April, the New York Knicks once again missed the playoffs. In a series of interviews with sports media outlets, Phil Jackson would start his 2017 offseason with a bang, not by announcing a signing or a trade, but just with his own words. In a press conference held after the season, Phil Jackson said,
We've not been able to win with him on the court at this time, and I think the direction with our team is that he is a player that would be better off somewhere else and using his talent somewhere where he can win or chase that championship.
After saying this, many Knicks fans of course stayed loyal to Carmelo Anthony, the man who was there before Phil Jackson, the man that chose the New York Knicks, and the man that they wanted after Phil Jackson. However, not just fans made their voices heard. A day after this statement, NBPA Executive Director Michelle Roberts came out with a statement saying, "We voiced with the commissioner today our view on the inappropriate comments by Knicks president Phil Jackson. If players under contract cannot, under threat of league discipline, speak openly about their desire to be employed elsewhere, we expect management to adhere to the same standards. The door swings both ways when it comes to demonstrating loyalty and respect." Following this event, Phil Jackson learned from his lesson and for the rest of the offseason kept his mouth shut in an attempt to somehow sneak one more year of leadership out of his contract. Just kidding. After these comments, Phil Jackson would go on to say that the team would be open to trading Kristaps Porzingis simply because he missed his exit interview. Phil Jackson would also justify this by saying this trade must be made relatively quickly in order to protect the future of the New York Knicks. As a result, you could imagine just how angry the fan base was, that Phil Jackson was trying to get rid of the sole good player he brought in by complete accident.
If Phil Jackson ends up trading Kristaps Porzingis, his punishment needs to be locked up in a room while Stephen A. Smith yells at him. The only good thing Phil Jackson has done for the New York Knicks is draft Kristaps Porzingis. Now he talks about trading him for 2 mediocre players. Phil Jackson may have been a great coach, but he is a disgrace to the NBA as a GM at New York Knicks. Trading Kristaps Porzingis, your franchise cornerstone, for nothing?
Not only was your average Knicks fan heated about what Phil Jackson was doing, but so was the loudest one on television. For nearly a week straight, Stephen A. Smith was on TV calling Phil Jackson a clown, and rightfully so. It's hard to imagine this part of sports history. The New York Knicks, for a portion of time, literally had a man antithetical to winning leading their front office, and along the way, managed to isolate nearly every single person in the entire organization. At this point, no one was even thinking about the 13 championships Phil Jackson has won. They were thinking that this man was clearly losing his mind and wasn't fit to make basketball decisions. On June 22nd, Phil Jackson made his final decision as president of basketball operations, as he partook in the 2017 NBA draft and drafted Frank Ntilikina 8th overall, along with Damian Dotson in the 2nd round. On June 28th, 2017, it was officially announced that the New York Knicks owner, James Dolan, had fired Phil Jackson, and that he will no longer be the president of the New York Knicks. When the news came out, if you saw New York City, you'd think everyone had just won the lottery. people running around in the streets, Knicks fans dancing near Madison Square Garden. It was as if the Knicks franchise had been moved away in 2014 and moved back into 2017. Sure, people may have been making fun of Phil Jackson, but it was because of what he had done to a franchise in desperate need of help. And instead of helping them, Phil Jackson spit in their face and got paid handsomely to do so. Knicks fans were ecstatic that the big bad boogeyman was finally gone, and they took every opportunity they had to show the NBA world, and Phil Jackson himself, that they were ecstatic.
At Phil Jackson 11, bye, don't let the door hit you on the way out, and take your rings and Kurt Rambis with you. Hashtag Phil Jackson sucks. At Phil Jackson, look, I know you got 10 rings, but with what you did to New York, you suck.
In fact, if these tweets aren't enough, take it from this Knicks fan himself, who was told live on TV that Phil Jackson had been fired.
That's good. That mean Melo stayed. That mean KP stayed. That mean we good. That mean we ate. Let's go. I'm ready to get it. Where do I sign up? Where's Stephen A? I need to talk to him now. That's what I'm. Oh my goodness. That's the best news I got all day, bro. That's the best news I got all year. Yes. I hate the. I'm mad that he had to lose his job, man. But I tell you, I'm a Knicks fan at heart. This smile is genuine, man. I feel good about this, man. I'm ready to run into somebody. Am I late? It don't even matter, bro. Phil Jackson gone.
After what had felt like decades, but in actuality was a grueling few years, the New York Knicks had finally rid themselves of the man who single-handedly turned a playoff team into a 17-win team in just 2 seasons. After the firing of Phil Jackson, the New York Knicks split his job into 2 separate roles. Steve Mills was hired to replace Phil Jackson as president of basketball operations, and Scott Perry was hired to become the new general manager. After the initial firing of Phil Jackson, many fans at the time believed that as a result, Carmelo Anthony would be open to staying with the franchise. However, after continuing to push for a trade, the New York Knicks were forced to trade him to the Oklahoma City Thunder for Doug McDermott, Enes Kanter, and a future second-round pick. What probably started the rumor mill about possibly firing Phil Jackson was his open animosity and disdain towards Carmelo Anthony. If it wasn't for openly being against your franchise's superstar, Phil Jackson might have gotten one more season as general manager. But the funniest thing regarding the Carmelo Anthony New York Knicks situation is that James Dolan is so incompetent as an owner that he managed to do what Carmelo Anthony wanted him to do, and somehow still couldn't convince him to stay with the franchise. As for Frank Ntilikina, Phil Jackson's parting gift with the New York Knicks that he took 8th overall before leaving, well, he no longer is a member of the New York Knicks, and in his 4-season Knicks career, just started 55 games in total. To be fair, the players drafted right after Frank Ntilikina weren't that good anyways. It was Dennis Smith Jr., Malik Monk, Luke Kennard, and oh yeah, an individual by the name of Donovan Mitchell. Maybe, just maybe, if Phil Jackson had watched workouts instead of notoriously falling asleep during their prospects' workouts, then maybe he would have been able to draft Donovan Mitchell instead of Frank Ntilikina. But ultimately, would Phil Jackson have even cared? According to Stephen A. Smith, Phil Jackson never even wanted to be a part of the New York Knicks organization to begin with. Instead, he only joined them because owner James Dolan kept increasing his offer to Jackson. And in his defense, at what point do you say no? He was offered $20 million, then $30 million, then $40 million. He probably got so tired of saying no that when James Dolan offered $60 million, he just said yes to shut him up. Ultimately, the New York Knicks were bad before Phil Jackson, and so far they haven't been too good after him, but the incompetency of Phil Jackson is funny for a brief second when you realize just how far the incompetency stretches in the New York Knicks organization. And you begin to realize that maybe the problem wasn't Phil Jackson. Maybe it's the owner who's too busy playing at his band's concert, a band that is named after him like a child, instead of trying to run a successful program in the largest market on the planet. Thank you for watching our first documentary on this channel. If there's any other moment that you'd like us to cover in NBA history, let us know in the comment section down below. Aside from that, I'm your boy Mike, and I'm dropping our mic until our next upload.